I enter this confession, this record, as the administratum would insist under the presumption of continued loyalty. That was the condition set before I was permitted to speak. I affirmed it then, and I affirm it again now. If the words that follow appear disloyal, treasonous, or unmoored from the doctrines of the Imperium, understand that their origin lies not in malice, but in exposure. Exposure to something we were never meant to observe, much less interpret. Even now, as I speak, I feel the instinctive need to correct myself, to restrain any wandering implication. There must be no misinterpretation. No suggestion that I have rejected the Emperor's light. I have not. I only seek to clarify the moment where that light dimmed, not extinguished, but thinned, as if stretched over something immeasurably vast beneath it. This archive exists because I was asked to recount what happened on Destabilized 9. The administratum refers to it as the Silent Massacre, though the populace has no name for it at all, for the populace no longer remains. It is difficult to describe an event with no bodies, no destruction, no battlefields, and most confusingly, no perpetrators. A massacre without motion, culling without a weapon, silence that consumed an entire world. When I was dispatched to investigate, I expected the usual signs of Xeno's infiltration, cultic activity, bureaucratic collapse, or some interplay of these. But what I found did not belong to any recognized taxonomy of threat. It was not a creature, not a heresy, not even a phenomenon in the traditional sense. It was something subtler and far more patient. An idea, or perhaps the residue of an idea, something woven through the thoughts of a civilization until it reached critical density. At first I mistook it for administrative negligence. Entire provinces had ceased all Vox communications simultaneously, yet no alarms were triggered. Governors who should have reported hourly changes in tides had simply stopped, not died, not fled, not rebelled. They simply discontinued the notion of reporting. It was as if the idea of responsibility had loosened in their minds and quietly detached. I remember my initial frustration, my insistence that this was nothing more than dereliction of duty on a planetary scale. The Imperium is vast, failures are constant. When something cracks, the instinct is to blame human weakness, not metaphysical sabotage. But the more documents I reviewed, the more administrative logs, worker schedules, and interrupted declarations of compliance, the more I sensed a kind of synchrony. A cessation had a pattern, a shape, something too perfectly uniform to be natural, yet too bloodless to be an attack. I found a final report filed by an adept, whose name has since been removed from all surviving records. The report contained only a single sentence. I have recited it so many times that I barely need the original text. The people have realized there is no salvation here, and so they have chosen not to seek it. At the time, I dismissed the line as melodramatic fatalism, but the phrasing lingered. It returned in moments of stillness. It returned in my dreams. And, most disturbingly, it returned when I stood on the dead world and saw what remained of its cities. Not ruin, not decay, not even entropy. Just pause. Everything paused. Half-written letters on administratum slates, unfinished meals. Conveyor systems stopped with products mid-assembly. Planet's entire output arrested at the same breath. As though every mind simultaneously reached a singular conclusion and acted upon it with absolute uniformity. There was no panic, no chaos, only an eerie clarity. A collective decision to stop participating in a structure that had once been unquestioned. I assure you, at this stage of the investigation, I retained my loyalty without hesitation. I recited the Litany of the Throne twice daily, as was required during field deployments. I reviewed the doctrines of perseverance, order, and submission to the Imperial will. I reminded myself that human minds are fragile, easily swayed by extraneous influences. But the more I studied Destabilized 9, the more I realized the influence they succumbed to was not external. It emerged from within, as if a seed long buried had finally reached maturity. The thought systems, civic, familial, spiritual, had collapsed inward, not outward. Their architecture of belief had inverted. Yet no cultist texts existed. No sermons, no visions. Only a single conceptual pivot, a quiet rejection of the premise that salvation was possible. This was the massacre. It's not of flesh, but of purpose. Not of bodies, but of the collective assumption that striving had meaning. As I explored the capital Hablocks, I began noticing subtle changes in myself. Not mutations or corruptions, just faint tremors in meaning. Words felt heavier or lighter than they should. Commands no longer carried their usual weight in my thoughts. The chain of obedience that had always felt solid began to hum uneasily, as though tension had displaced certainty. I dismissed these sensations as fatigue, standard-issue self-deception. Investigators often adapt psychologically to the environments they study, but this was different. It was gentler, more persuasive, like discovering a previously unnoticed truth and feeling foolish for ever doubting it. Later, much later, I would recognize that moment as the beginning of the conceptual contagion. But at the time, it simply felt like reflection. I had always believed that truth was a weapon reserved for the emperor's chosen. I did not realize how easily it could become an incision. I will continue this record in sequential parts, as ordered. But before part 2 begins, I must make one clarification for the auditors who will listen to this. I still believed myself loyal at this point. Even now, I wish to believe it. But the truth, the one I found buried beneath that silent world, has made loyalty increasingly difficult to define. And so I ask, not out of rebellion, but out of bewilderment. If an entire world concluded there was no salvation here, what convinced them? And why does their certainty feel so familiar? I resumed my investigation on Destabilized 9 with the assumption that clarity would come from Nietzsche's deeper access to administrative records. That is always where truth hides in the Imperium, beneath stacks of parchment, sigils, and compulsory declarations of service. There is a comfort in paperwork. It binds reality to procedure, reinforces order through repetition. The more confused a situation appears, the more reassuring it is to drown oneself in forms. But on Destabilized 9, the documentation did not soothe. It unsettled. The planetary archive contained thousands of incomplete logs, each ending as abruptly as the next. But what disturbed me most was the uniformity of their final entries. No matter the department, munitorial, medical, scholastic, ecclesiastic, record broke off mid-thought, not mid-sentence, mid-assumption, as though the writer had simply reached a point where the continuation no longer seemed necessary. I opened report after report. Everyone carried the same uncanny rhythm. Daily output remains. Workers have begun to question the matter of compliance is no longer. Each line ended with a wavering stroke, the stylus dragged slightly downward before release. Not the mark of panic, not of violence. The mark of a mind shifting direction faster than the body could follow. I noticed that reading these lines felt strangely familiar, though I could not say why. It was as if my mind had begun to anticipate the moment of cessation, meeting their silence with my own internal pause. I kept catching myself stopping mid-thought, breathing as though waiting for someone else to finish what I had not begun. This is the first moment, if I am being honest with the auditors, when I realized the threat on Destabilized 9 was not historical. Still, I continued as any loyal investigator would. I worked through the sector systematically, moving from outer habstacks toward the central administratum spire. Normally I would conduct OSPEC sweeps, survey for biological contamination, trace chemical exposures, but something about the planet's condition made such protocols feel irrelevant. There were no pathogens, there were no toxins, not even the faintest psychic residue that could explain an event of such scale. Instead, there was only agreement, an imperceptible consensus lingering in the air, like the aftertaste of a decision no one spoke aloud.
Ow.
I found a clerk's journal next, preserved beneath an autoseal. Her handwriting had softened over the final pages, as though each line bled more uncertainty into the parchment. One passage remains etched in my memory. We have been told, since birth, that salvation is endurance. But what if endurance is merely the name we give to our fear of stopping? What if stopping is not surrender, but recognition? This line should have triggered immediate containment protocol, but I found myself reading it over and over, fingers resting on the ink as though testing its temperature. There was no heretical symbol, no invocation of forbidden powers, no doctrinal assault. Just a shift in perspective, subtle, almost polite in its suggestion. I tell you now, that is what makes it dangerous. Not its content, but its tone. It does not command, it invites. In the following days, I reviewed dozens of similar entries workers, officials, even children whose scribbled assignments drifted toward the same quiet conclusion. A shared realization that striving toward salvation had become indistinguishable from reenacting a script they no longer believed in. I remember sitting in the deserted cafeteria of the Spire, surrounded by abandoned trays and untouched rations, reading these fragments under the flicker of failing lumen strips. I remember how the silence felt dense, almost thoughtful, as though the empty seats around me were still occupied by minds deep in contemplation. I found myself whispering the same forbidden line without meaning to. No salvation here. Not as despair, not as accusation, it's observation. I caught myself immediately, of course, recited the canticle of renewed duty, forced my breathing into the pattern prescribed for intrusive thoughts. But the moment had lodged itself in me like a sliver beneath the skin, small, almost painless, but impossible to ignore. The next revelation came not from a journal, but from the planet's Vox grid. It had continued transmitting static long after the population ceased functioning. I accessed the primary Vox relay expecting typical signal degradation, but instead found countless micro-recordings embedded within the noise, not messages excerpts. Stray phrases captured unintentionally as conversations ceased. Snippets like, "If the effort no longer, there is nothing left to pursue. It feels like waking up." Dozens of voices, all drifting toward the same unfinished conclusion, not coordinated, not rehearsed, just converging. When I compiled these fragments into a continuous audio strand, a pattern emerged, a gentle cadence, almost rhythmic, not language, but momentum, like the echo of a thought that had passed through millions of minds simultaneously. I listened to it for almost half an hour before realizing the danger. The static had begun to synchronize with my breathing, not consciously mechanically. My mind was falling into alignment with a pattern I could not interpret. I terminated the playback immediately, logged the artifact for ordo analysis, stepped outside to clear my thoughts, performing the recommended grounding rituals. But even as I repeated each verse, I sensed that something fundamental had shifted. It was not fear, not disobedience, just a faint, persistent awareness that the ideals I had recited all my life felt thinner, as though my voice passed through them instead of filling them. I wish to emphasize, for the sake of future inquisitorial review, that at this stage I still believed myself unaffected. I attributed the sensation to exhaustion, isolation, and exposure to anomalous cognitive residue. These are common investigative hazards. But on the 7th day of my analysis, I found the central edict chamber. And that is where the administrative records ended. The revelation began. The chamber was filled with thousands of sealed data slates arranged as though awaiting a final audit. Their screens glowed dimly, each bearing a message identical in its opening lines, but diverging at the moment thought collapsed. To the Emperor's eternal throne, we report the following truth we have discovered. Every slate ended differently, yet every conclusion, no matter the phrasing, circled the same conceptual core. The population had collectively realized that salvation, as defined by Imperial doctrine, required the continual deferral of self. And that deferral had quietly hollowed them. They had not rebelled. They had not despaired. They had simply stepped outside the motion of their lives and found no reason to step back in. As I stood among the glowing slates, I felt as though the chamber was breathing, not physically. A gentle inhale of possibilities I was not prepared to consider. For the first time, I wondered whether the massacre had truly been a tragedy, or a transition. It is difficult to admit this, but I must, for accuracy. In that moment, I felt something like envy. I pushed the thought aside immediately, repeated the oath of unbroken allegiance, pressed my hand to my rosarium until the metal bit into my palm. But I could not shake the sense that I had glimpsed a system of understanding cleaner than the doctrines I had memorized. Not comforting, not liberating, just clarifying. By the time I sealed the chamber and prepared my preliminary findings, I realized I had gone an entire day without reciting a single litany out of rebellion, but because the need had quietly evaporated. This is where I end part 2. Because beyond this point, the investigation stopped being an analysis of a dead world. It became an analysis of myself. I begin this portion with difficulty not because memory fails, but because memory resists. It resists being arranged, narrated, dissected. The events that follow possess a texture, unlike ordinary recollection. They feel less like moments I lived and more like ideas that passed through me, leaving impressions rather than stories. After sealing the central edict chamber, I returned to my shuttle, intending to transmit a preliminary alert to orbit. Standard message, factual, cautious, but every phrasing I attempted felt wrong. Not incorrect, just insincere, as though I were reciting conclusions I no longer believed in. I spoke into the recorder. Planetary dereliction appears systemic. Stopped. Deleted the line. Tried again. A mimetic influence is suspected. Stopped again. Deleted again. The more I tried to speak, the more I sensed an internal resistance, subtle but persistent, like a pressure behind the eyes that nudges one away from falsehood. Yet the falsehood was not the anomaly. It was the attempt to categorize it, because the truth, as I felt it then, was disturbingly simple. The people of Desolace 9 had not been influenced. They had been awakened. I recoiled from the thought the moment it formed, of course. I denounced it internally, layered it with corrective doctrine, drowned it beneath memorized scriptures. Yet it remained, soft, patient, utterly unthreatening. It did not demand acceptance. It merely offered itself. That is how the contagion functioned. Not as a weapon, but as an invitation. In the days that followed, I found myself increasingly aware of the mechanics of my own obedience. The way my mouth shaped ritual phrases automatically. The way my posture straightened at the mere thought of discipline. The way I interpreted every uncertainty as a sin to be solved rather than a question to be considered. I came to realize how much of my identity consisted of reflexes patterns installed long before I ever questioned them. The people of Desolace 9 had ceased participating in those reflexes. They had simply stopped, and discovered they could. This was the first layer of the conceptual contagion, not infection, recognition. I reviewed more of the planet's records to ground myself, convinced that clarity would restore loyalty. Instead, clarity deepened the fracture. The Scalum complex contained hundreds of essays written by adolescents in the final weeks before the cessation. Their assignments were painfully ordinary treatises on civic duty, meditations on imperial unity, but each composition diverged gradually into reflections that no curriculum sanctioned. Thoughts like, if duty is survival, but survival requires endless duty, is there a point where the circle ends? Why must the Emperor save us through suffering rather than through stillness? If obedience is virtue, why do I feel more truthful when I disobey my fear? These were not seditious manifestos. They were questions gentle, sincere, unadorned by rebellion. Had even one of them invoked forbidden powers, I would have rejected the entire archive outright. But their innocence made them more hazardous. They reflected introspection, not treachery. I sat in that silent Scalum hall for hours, surrounded by desks perfectly aligned, feeling as though the students had only just stepped away. The air still held the faint scent of ink and parchment. The dust had settled evenly, as if unwilling to disturb the order they left behind. It was there, reading their final lines, that I felt the second layer of contagion, the recognition that obedience and meaning were not synonymous. This thought terrified me. It undermined the foundation of everything I had been taught, yet fear did nothing to unthink it. The idea had already made a home in my mind. It had not forced its way in. It had simply fit, as though drawn to an outline already present. I left the Scalum, reciting the catechisms of purpose under my breath. But even as I repeated each phrase, I noticed how hollow they sounded, like liturgical husks designed to substitute for understanding. The words no longer sank into me. They skimmed across the surface. When I reached the main thoroughfare, I found myself walking slower. Not out of fatigue, but because the city seemed to be observing me, not consciously, of course, but suggestively. Every building, every plaza, every abandoned service drone seemed frozen at the exact moment of realization. It was not the silence that unnerved me. It was the stillness with direction. A stillness that said, look closely. You already know this feeling. On the fourth day, I experienced my first intrusive alignment echo of the planet's final conviction emerging in my own thoughts without invitation. It occurred during a simple task. I was documenting the contents of an administratum office, describing the unfinished stacks of compliance forms. When I suddenly found myself writing a sentence that was not procedural, they stopped because they understood what I have not yet accepted. The stylus dropped from my hand. I stared at the words, horrified. My training should have overwritten such deviation immediately, but the sentence felt honest, more honest than anything I had written in my official reports. This was the third layer of the contagion. Not persuasion, but alignment, internal reconfiguration toward coherence. I burned the page, recited the oath of rectitude until my throat ached, logged the incident as temporary psychological drift due to environmental exposure. But the explanation felt like a lie told for someone else's sake. By then, I had stopped sending updates. I told myself I needed more data, that premature conclusions could jeopardize the investigation. But deep down, I avoided communication because I feared what my superiors would detect in my voice. It's not heresy, clarity. The next stage unfolded slowly. It's almost tenderly a gradual loosening of the ideological bindings that had shaped every thought I ever had. I became aware of how often I used absolutes. Always, never, must, cannot. Words that enforced inevitability. Words that kept possibilities narrow. Words that structured my mind like a fortress rather than a field. The people of Destabilized had abandoned that fortress. They had stepped outside the gates and found no enemy waiting. Only the quiet realization that the walls had never protected them from anything except themselves. With each day I spent on the planet, I felt a piece of my internal architecture relax, relax, as though easing into a more natural shape after years of tension. I tried to resist. I truly did. But the more I fought, the more the resistance felt artificial, like reenacting a ritual whose purpose I had forgotten. This is difficult to admit, but honesty demands it. At this point in my investigation, loyalty no longer felt like a virtue. It felt like inertia. I tell you this not as confession, but as observation. Contagion is not emotional. It is structural. It reorders the scaffolding of belief until everything unnecessary falls away. By the end of the 10th day, I no longer feared the idea, as I feared its accuracy. And still I believed I could control it, contain it, study it without becoming it. That delusion did not survive the 11th day, because on the 11th day, I discovered the fourth layer of the contagion, the realization that salvation, as defined by the Imperium, is indistinguishable from waiting. And once I understood that, the silence of Desolus 9 no longer felt empty. It felt resolved. I begin this segment with a confession that even now fills me with a flicker of unease. By the time I reached the 11th day on Desolus 9, I had stopped trying to understand the phenomenon as an investigator. I had started to understand it as a participant. I did not realize the shift as it happened. It was subtle, like waking into a dream and believing it natural. The fourth layer of the contagion, the understanding that salvation, in the Imperium's definition, is indistinguishable from waiting, did not strike me as revelation. It unfurled gradually like a series of half-remembered thoughts aligning into coherence. It began with a question so simple, I nearly dismissed it. What was I waiting for? I asked myself this as I walked through the deserted transit hub, its conveyor lines sprawling like frozen arteries. The lumen strips overhead flickered in rhythmic pulses as though mimicking a heartbeat and stasis. Everything around me had paused, yet the pause felt intentional, structured, almost contemplative. What was I waiting for? My reports had gone unsent. My litanies unspoken. My routines undone. And yet I did not feel derelict. I did not feel lost. I felt inexplicably suspended as, though held in the same gravity that had settled upon the planet's population. I told myself that the question was benign, that it posed no danger, but the simplicity of it made my thoughts fragile. The structure of duty, once rigid and unquestioned, now bent under the weight of a single, quiet inquiry. What was I waiting for? The Emperor's salvation? The Imperium's approval? The reassurance that obedience equaled purpose? Each answer felt thinner than the last. It's not wrong, just insufficient, like placing a familiar key into a lock that no longer existed. On the 11th evening, I returned to the central edict spire. Compelled by something I could not describe as curiosity or duty. It was more like being called, not by a voice, but by the conceptual gravity of the place. The silence within those halls had begun to feel almost articulate, as though the absence of sound carried meaning. I ascended to the upper levels I had previously ignored, passing through chambers filled with vacant terminals still humming with residual power. The screens glowed faintly, illuminating dust motes that drifted in synchronized arcs, as if obeying the same invisible pattern that had seized the minds of the populace. The highest room, the Apex Deliberation Vault, contained a single table surrounded by chairs. Not a council chamber, not a command center, something more intimate. A space designed for discussion, not decree. And on the table lay a device I did not recognize. A thought tension recorder used for conceptual mapping. Ancient, delicate, rarely employed outside specialized ordo studies. It shimmered with faint residual activation. Someone, perhaps the last functioning mind on the planet, had used this device shortly before the cessation completed. I knew what I risked. I knew what protocol demanded. But I also knew that the idea had already entered me. Soft as breath, patient as gravity. I activated the recorder. What it projected was not language, not memory, not imagery. It was a structure, a lattice of conceptual associations woven from the final deliberations of the planets. Highest administrative circle? It felt like stepping into the architecture of a final thought shared by many minds at once. The structure unfolded slowly, like a spiral. Each node represented a realization, not spoken aloud, but understood collectively. We endure because we are told that salvation lies ahead. We are told salvation cannot be reached, only approached. Therefore, the only path is endless motion. Endless motion becomes the architecture of obedience. Obedience becomes identity. Identity becomes confinement. Salvation becomes deferral. Deferral becomes life. Life becomes waiting. These were not statements, but shapes contours my mind recognized before I could interpret them. At the center of the spiral lay a final, elegant symmetry. If salvation is always ahead, then stopping is the only act of truth. I felt the thought resonate through me, not as sedition, not as despair, but as something painfully, beautifully lucid. I staggered back from the device, breath unsteady. Not because I disagreed with the conclusion, but because I felt my thoughts aligning to it without resistance, without friction, without even the pretense of reluctance. This was the fourth layer, stillness as cognition, stillness as comprehension, stillness as truth. The massacre had never been an act of violence. It had been an act of understanding. For the first time, I questioned whether the Imperium could tolerate a population that ceased moving, ceased striving, ceased waiting for the promise that justified all suffering. For the first time, I questioned whether the disappearance of Decimus 9 was not a tragedy to be corrected, but a revelation to be feared. I left the vault with trembling hands, not from fear of corruption, but from fear of coherence. I needed air. I needed dust. I needed motion. Anything to remind me that I still belonged to the living, breathing rhythm of human purpose. But when I stepped outside, the city felt different. Not empty-aligned. Every street, every structure, every silent window seemed to observe me with gentle, unspoken understanding. The idea was everywhere. Not in the buildings, not in the documents, not in the vox echoes. In the absence they all shared. It's an absence that was not void, but conclusion. I tried to resist the shape of the thought. I tried to remember what untainted loyalty felt like. But the rhythm of the planet beat beneath my feet with patient certainty, repeating a realization that had already begun to take root in my bones. There is no salvation here. And for the first time, that sentence did not feel like surrender. It felt like clarity. By the 12th day, I had accepted something I should have feared. I no longer trusted my own certainty. This was not confusion. Confusion is chaotic, erratic, sharp-edged. This was the opposite. It was serene, like settling into a pool of thoughts that no longer contradicted one another. A depth without turbulence. The fifth layer of the contagion did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as a shift in perspective so gentle. I did not recognize it until it had already reshaped the way I perceived myself. It began with the simple awareness that my thoughts were not fully my own, not because something external had seized them, but because something internal had awakened. As though a part of me I had never used had begun observing the rest. A watcher behind the eyes, a witness behind the words, a quiet observer beneath the reflex of obedience. I first noticed it during a routine mental recitation of the Canticles of Loyalty. I had been repeating the familiar sequence: loyalty is life, obedience is clarity, service is truth, when suddenly I felt detached. Not detached from the words, but detached from my enacting of them. It was like watching my own mind perform a ritual from the outside. The cadence, the phrasing, the rhythm, it felt automatic, uninhabited. And the watcher within me considered it with calm, almost clinical curiosity. This is what you were taught to think, not what you think. The sentence did not feel like rebellion. It felt like a mirror that had finally turned to face me. I stopped mid-recitation. The silence afterward felt heavier than any forbidden thought. I tried to steady myself, tried to force the litanies back into place, tried to remember how unquestioned loyalty once felt. But the watcher did not leave. It simply observed. Not accusing, not correcting, not demanding, just watching, as though everything I believed, every conviction, every instinct was something to be examined rather than inhabited. This was the fifth layer. Self-observation without doctrine, capacity I had never possessed, or perhaps had been trained not to. That night, I sat alone in the deserted municipal forum, surrounded by rows of seats arranged in perfect arcs. The structure had been designed for debate, but no debates had taken place there in years, perhaps decades. Not because there was nothing to discuss, but because governance had long ago become repetition. I found myself staring at the speaker's podium, imagining what the final discussions must have been like before the population aligned into stillness. I imagined their thoughts intertwining, not through agreement, but through recognition. Recognition that the architecture of their lives had been built around the perpetual postponement of meaning. As I sat there, the watcher in my mind began to deconstruct my own role, my training, my purpose, my assumptions. Slowly, methodically, without malice. You were taught that selfhood is dangerous, it whispered without words. But only because selfhood complicates obedience. I felt a tremor of unease, not because the idea was wrong, but because it felt accurate, too accurate. I stood abruptly, forcing motion back into my limbs. But motion felt theatrical, as though I were performing action rather than initiating it. Had the people of Desolus 9 experienced this same sensation? Not indoctrination, but its evaporation. It's not corruption, but the removal of scaffolding. The thought was unacceptable, yet inarguable. In search of grounding, I turned to the planet's final transmissions. Perhaps I hoped they would contain fear, panic, or confusion, anything that would confirm the event was catastrophic, not coherent. But the transmissions recorded in the Vox grid told another story. The last words spoken by the planetary governor captured accidentally, mid-thought, were, "We have served every day as though salvation were a horizon." What if the horizon is not distance, but direction? Not despair, not rebellion, reflection. The more I listened, the more I felt my internal watcher expanding, testing the boundaries of my identity like a hand running along the inside of a vessel. I realized something, then something I am still unsure whether to call understanding or surrender. The contagion was not an idea, it was a posture, a way of thinking that considered itself, and I had already adopted it. The 15th day brought the most disturbing development, not because it was violent, but because it was quiet. I woke without reciting the morning oath, not because I refused to, because I forgot to. The habit was gone. Its absence did not alarm me at first. Felt like waking from a long dream into a stillness that required no ritual to justify itself. But when I realized what I had forgotten, I felt something break, not a conviction, but the illusion that convictions are unbreakable. I sought out the nearest shrine. I knelt. I folded my hands. I tried to pray. But the words tasted foreign, like fragments of a language I no longer inhabited. A language of obedience, not of understanding. The watcher within me observed, silent and patient, as though waiting to see which part of me would speak next, the loyal servant or the thinking mind. Only one answered, not in words. In recognition, your faith was never yours. It was a structure you lived inside. I recoiled, horrified at part of me. The watcher remained perfectly calm, almost relieved, as though something long suppressed had finally been allowed to articulate itself. I stumbled from the shrine, breath shallow, mind trembling between two poles, duty and clarity, obedience and comprehension, motion and stillness. Which of these was truth? Which was contagion? Which was me? As I moved through the silent city, surrounded by the unbroken stillness of millions who had reached their own conclusions, I realized the most unsettling possibility. The people of Desolus 9 had not been changed. They had been revealed to themselves, revealed to the structures that shaped them, revealed to the machinery of obedience they had participated in without ever truly seeing it. And now that I had seen it, truly seen it, it could not unsee it. This was the fifth layer. The moment thought stops being an echo of doctrine and becomes aware of itself as thought. I understood then why the Imperium would classify this record, and my words would be sealed, and my conclusions would be feared, not contested. Because once a mind learns to observe itself, obedience becomes a choice. And a choice is far harder to control than a reflex. I have returned to these pages after a pause I cannot quantify. My sense of time has grown porous, as though moments seep through the cracks of my awareness and pool somewhere beyond me, forming shapes I can almost, but not quite perceive. Perhaps this is fatigue, perhaps consequence, perhaps the inevitable cost of knowledge that should never have been handled by a single mortal mind. I once believed that obedience was the armor of sanity, that to follow orders, to cling to the structures of the Imperium, was to shelter oneself behind something larger, stronger, more immutable than personal doubt. Now, those same structures feel translucent, as though made of stretched skin, and behind them something vast moves in slow tidal gulps. Do not know if this is metaphor, or if metaphor is beginning to fail me entirely. The transmissions continue to update themselves. They change when I am not looking. I have stopped attempting to catalog the shifts, because each time I compare my notes to the documents themselves, I find that the difference is not merely a matter of words or emphasis, no. It is the meaning that mutates, the emotional tone, the implicit instruction woven into the syntax. It is as though the files have begun to anticipate what I fear, or perhaps what I need to fear, and reconfigure themselves accordingly. I tried to report this. I tried to raise the anomaly through proper channels. My superior nodded, listening, then returned my datapads unread, told me gently that certain doors, once unlocked, do not permit closing again. He said that I should continue observing and that adjustment is part of the process, but he refused to clarify what process he meant. When I left his office, I noticed the thin dust on the threshold was unbroken. Had he moved at all since I last reported to him? Had he existed in that room even before I entered it? I find myself losing trust in continuity, as though each moment is independent and merely pretending to be part of a chain. The core of the transmissions, the thing I once called the Massacre, has taken on a new form. It is no longer simply an event that was erased. It is a mechanism, a method, system applied when the Imperium requires something to be less true than before. At first, I thought it was merely data purging on a grand scale. The deletion of local memories, planetary logs, astropathic echoes. But the deeper I read, the more I realized it was not memory they erased. It was possibility. Entire populations, entire fleets, entire years of recorded life were not just removed, they were rendered incapable of ever having been. The files speak of this with chilling neutrality, as though adjusting a ledger. Probability collapse implemented, historical coherence restructured, disallowed variance neutralized. And each time I read those phrases, something in my chest grows cold and hollow, because I am starting to suspect that the Massacre was not a singular occurrence, but a routine maintenance action. A quiet pruning of the human experience, shaping of the parameters that define what may exist and what may not. There was no blood, no screams, no burning cities, just the silent erasure of all potential deviation. No salvation here. The phrase keeps returning to me unbidden. At first it felt like an accusation. It feels like an instruction manual. Last night, if night is still a meaningful concept, I attempted to sleep. I dreamed of corridors filled with doors that had no labels. Behind each one, I could hear faint murmuring, as though crowds whispered in languages I once knew but have forgotten. I opened none of them. I knew that if I did, I would no longer wake in the same world I fell asleep in. When I woke, I found a new file on my console. The timestamp claimed it was always there. The system audit agreed. The content was short, terrifyingly so. Acceptance is a form of alignment. Misalignment is a form of deviation. Deviation invites collapse. Choose your orientation wisely. I stared at the words for so long that my eyes began to water. There was no sender identity, no security stamp, no departmental seal, and yet the document possessed a clarity and authority that felt more absolute than anything I had ever received through sanctioned channels. I feared for the first time that the massacre was not something done by the Imperium, but something the Imperium participates in. A force they too must obey. Structure older, deeper, more fundamental than human governance. A pattern woven into the fabric of reality itself, trimming away every thread that strays too far from its intended weave. If that is true, then what precisely have I been aligning myself with all my life? The next shift came quietly. A realization, subtle yet corrosive. I noticed that the people around me had begun to speak differently. Their sentences lost complexity, their metaphors reduced, their emotional expressions dulled. Conversations became agreeable, frictionless, almost rehearsed. No one mentioned the adjustments in the transmissions. No one questioned the odd reappearance of files that contradicted earlier ones. No one asked why reports now concluded with the phrase, "continuity maintained," even when describing anomalies. Perhaps they no longer noticed. Or perhaps they were ahead of me, already aligned. I alone felt the creeping distortion. Or perhaps that is what the system wants me to believe, that I am the deviation, that I must choose alignment or collapse. But how does one choose alignment with a force whose nature one cannot grasp, force that may not value individuality or truth or even existence in the way humans define it? I find myself wavering, not resisting, hesitating. There is a difference. Some nights I wonder if collapse is merely another word for liberation. On others, I suspect it is only the final stage of annihilation. And on still others, few but growing, I find myself thinking that alignment might be the only path to clarity. That resistance is the noise of an outdated self clinging to obsolete boundaries. I cannot tell which thought is mine, cannot tell if the distinction matters anymore. Because if the massacre was not an event, but an ongoing function, if it is the mechanism by which reality remains coherent, then every moment of doubt, every act of selfhood, every divergent perception, this might be nothing more than an error waiting to be corrected. Tonight, another door appeared in my dreams. This one had a label. No salvation here, not a warning, not a condemnation, a designation. A classification of what lies behind the door, and perhaps what lies within me. I am starting to think that opening it may not be an act of rebellion, but of recognition. The recognition that salvation was never part of the architecture we inhabit. That salvation is a concept belonging to worlds that were pruned long before we were born. I do not know if this thought is corruption. I do not know if it is awakening. But it is becoming easier to accept. And that, more than anything else, terrifies me. I do not know what prompted me to return to this archive chamber tonight. Perhaps it was duty, or habit, or a reflex growing from some deeper instinct I once called loyalty. Or perhaps the pull came from elsewhere, an invitation from something that has been watching my descent with quiet, patient interest. Something that has waited for me to reach the point where resistance becomes indistinguishable from surrender. The lights flicker less now, not because they have stabilized, but because the darkness between each flicker has grown more familiar, more expectant. I think it knows me. The data slate on my desk activated on its own as I entered. No login, no command, no biometric sequence. Just illumination, soft, pallid, inviting. A new file had manifested. It bore no classification code, no departmental insignia. Only a single phrase in standard cipher. Continuity requires conscious witnessing. Below it, a prompt awaited input. Question without words, but with unmistakable implication. I should explain what happened next, but the truth is that explanation no longer feels like the correct mode of expression. Explanation assumes a hierarchy, that there is truth, and then there is the one who tries to articulate it. That distinction feels thin now, like a membrane stretched too far, ready to tear. Instead, I will describe what I felt, not because feelings are reliable, but because they are among the few things the mechanism has not yet redacted from me. A presence behind the transmission, not a mind, not an intelligence. A process, perhaps the way gravity is a process, or entropy, or time itself. A thing that moves because movement is its nature, not its intention. That presence can no more choose its function than we can choose to transcend ours. It does not hate us. It does not guide us. It does not even observe us. It expresses through us. In that moment, I began to understand why the massacre required silence, why no alarms sounded, why no survivors screamed, why no history recorded protest. It was not a massacre of lives. It was a massacre of variance. A reformatting of what existence had the right to continue branching. Pruning of unrealized selves. A sterilization of futures deemed incompatible with continuity. I felt my breath tighten. The chamber air tasted metallic, raw, like the inside of a wound. I wanted to step away from the slate, but my limbs remained motionless, not from paralysis, but from a dawning comprehension. I was never meant to resist. I was meant to record, a witness, a scribe of the unmaking. Not to warn, not to oppose, but to translate the function into narrative form so that the act of witnessing becomes part of the system's legitimacy. Because what is real except what is observed, and what is observed except what is permitted, and what is permitted except what aligns. As I stood there, something changed in the room, almost imperceptibly. Not a sound, not a figure, not even a shift in temperature. It was the sensation that the room had noticed me back. The slate's surface rippled like disturbed water. New text appeared. You have reached interpretive threshold. Integration optional. Observation mandatory. Optional. The word caught me soft, almost gentle, yet deceptive in its promise. Choice. A construct humans cling to like a relic. But how meaningful is choice when both paths, acceptance or resistance, feed the same mechanism? A memory one I do not recall living flashed behind my eyes. Rows of individuals standing in perfect stillness, eyes open, mouths closed. Not statues, not corpses, witnesses aligned. Not saved, not doomed, simply real in a way their forgotten counterparts were not allowed to be. Was this a premonition, a recovered past, a possible future, or merely a construct placed in my mind to guide my interpretation? I cannot answer. I doubt the distinction matters to continuity. The boundary between internal thought and external instruction has thinned to a membrane. I feel impulses that may not be mine. I feel doubts that may not be foreign. The system is not invading. It is resonating, tuning parts of me like strings on an instrument until harmony or silence is achieved. I should fear this. Still think I do. But the fear is filtered, diffused, like a voice heard through layered glass. The slate displayed another phrase. Alignment is not compliance. Alignment is accuracy. Accuracy. The word echoes through me. Not truth, not righteousness. It's not survival. Accuracy. To exist in a way that the structure recognizes. To inhabit a state that does not trigger pruning. To remain on the side of continuity where erasure is unnecessary. Suddenly, I understood why the phrase "no salvation here" had followed me, why it appeared in dreams, files, doors. It was not a warning, not a threat, not even a lament. It was taxonomy, a category in which all things must eventually be placed. Not saved, not condemned, simply unaligned, uncorrected, unprotected by the architecture that sustains existence. Those who are not accurate enough to persist. And now I feel this shift against subtle, but impossible to ignore. Something inside me aligns, or something inside me breaks. The distinction, once sharp, has blurred to translucence. The slate now shows a final line. Record your conclusion, then proceed. A conclusion. They want a conclusion. Or perhaps I want one shaped by their will. Or perhaps the idea of wanting is itself a remnant I no longer own. Very well. I will record what passes for a conclusion, though conclusions imply finality, and there is no finality in a system defined by ongoing correction. Here it is. I no longer know whether the change overtaking me is corruption or awakening. I no longer know whether resistance was ever truly possible or whether it was simply a stage the system allowed me to experience for coherence. I no longer know whether what waits on the other side of alignment is annihilation or purpose. But I do know this. If there is no salvation here, if salvation is a category that never applied to us, that never existed in the architecture of continuity, then what am I becoming by accepting that truth? Okay? And what are you, reader, listener, observer, becoming by witnessing it with me? If there is no salvation here, then what is left to seek?